Koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, hoki mai. I'm Rose, I'm the Chief Executive of Community Governance Aotearoa. Thank you for joining us for our Board Talk today. So Board Talks is a series designed by our not-for-profit, for-purpose community organisations about key issues that affect us. Just to let you know that we are recording today's session and all our talks are freely available on our website. Just as everyone is joining us, we would love to hear who you are, where you're from. So this is going to be a very exciting conversation. Policies, what do we need to govern well? It's been much needed discussion, I think, and today we have a fabulous panel guest brave enough to join us and discuss all things policy, so well done. I just want to do a big shout out to our sponsors though, which is Havana Coffee Works. So thanks again, our panel guests do get a nice coffee pack for their time and sharing their expertise with us. So throughout the conversation, please feel free to ask us a question or ask our panel guest question that you would like to know. Board Talks is designed to be relaxed and formal. We're having a conversation, but we're kind of just getting really straight to it as well. So we have two wonderful guests with us. We've got Amanda and Mark. I'm going to ask Amanda to introduce herself, and it would be nice, Amanda, if you could share a few words that your friends might describe you. Like, how do your friends describe Amanda?
Oh, I might be Nigel No Mates, Rosie. Okay, kia ora everyone, it's great to be here. So obviously Amanda Hema, I'm Chief Executive for the South Waikato Investment Fund Trust and have had the pleasure of working and sitting on boards across the Waikato region. What would people say about me? I hope that they'd say I'm approachable, and I hope that they'd say I bring out the best in people, make them excited about, you know, what they can do and the impact they can have. I hope. So we'll keep my fingers crossed and I'll check in with them later.
Oh, it sounds good. And I'm sure, and I've had the pleasure of meeting you in person and spending some time with you, Amanda, and you're very engaging, very supportive. So it's wonderful to have you here with us today. And I'm sure you're going to give us some really great insights and guidance on policy. So thank you. And Mark, so also know Mark very well from Rotorua. I think, are you calling in Mark today? Yeah. And again, how would your friends describe you, Mark? Is there some pleasant words that they would say about you?
Kia ora tātou, everyone on the call. Just to confirm, I'm the reason I'm here. I think I run a consultancy called Great Boards, and we provide advice to SMEs, NFPs, not-for-profits, and farming boards around New Zealand. And to answer your question, Rose, I would like to think that my friends might say that I'm a good listener. It's something I've tried to do in my community governance involvement, although I was just thinking if you ask my wife, you might get a different response. We'll see.
Yes, so again, thank you for spending some time with us today. And our board talk discussion is, what policies do we need to govern? So my first question is, why are governing policies so important? Why do we need policies? Why do we need governing policies? There's going to be a big difference, and I'm sure we'll get into this. But why are they so important to us?
I think if, for me, when I look at both sides of the equation, management, operations, and of course governance, there's a heck of a lot of compliance nowadays that's really critical to acknowledge when you're sitting on a board. And with that comes responsibility. And particularly for not-for-profits, you've got significant numbers of stakeholders. Often you're stewards of public money, which in itself has responsibilities. So it's the way I look at policies is they're kind of the gel that makes sure that the compliance parts of our responsibilities are being looked after. I also think they're really critical for making sure that everyone's on the same page. You know, if something's in writing, you've got that resilience that when the board changes or when new staff comes, there's a line in the sand, what's acceptable, what's not, what we do. So that's why I think they're really critical. Get everyone on the same page and make sure there's collective responsibility and it's understood.
Yes, and that's that is the crux of why we need policies, isn't it? Is to shape the culture and make sure if there is change, it's embedded about what good governance practice looks like. So Mark, have you got some thoughts here as well about governing policies and the importance of them?
Yeah, I agree with Amanda, absolutely. The thing with policies is that without them, the board is running, without its headlights on in some ways, because the board's not clear let's call it the directors, or the board members, or call it members, are not clear what the sort of beginning and the end of their responsibilities are. And some of these matters are extremely important. For example, if you have a chief executive of your organisation, and if you don't, you might have a secretary. What level of financial control, for example, does that person have below the board? And another quick example: if you don't have a policy which sets out how you're going to bring a new member into your community governance organisation, then I can tell you from experience that member, and I was one of them once, really won't know what they're expected to do, and it can end in that member leaving because they're not quite sure. They were never really told what was expected of them. So that is just a couple of quick examples why policies, in my view, are critical to any organisation.
Yes, and that's essentially why we're having this discussion today, is to kind of get to the heart of all the things that we need, and potentially how we can kind of get a little bit lost in the governing policy space. So I thought it might be good for us to talk first about what governance policies are we responsible for as a board, but then the management of policies. And sometimes I think we can get a little bit confused of where they sit with responsibilities and who should be doing what, or how do we shape what we need as governors without getting into the management detail, and when do we kind of pass them over, that kind of thing. So it's a really important space for us, because most of our community organisations don't always have clear management teams, and then we don't have the big CEs. So it's very important, like when are we crossing over, and have we got some thoughts and some examples we can share? Who'd like to go, Mark?
Yeah, sure. So I'm very much talking about a community governance situation. So often I've sat on the committee, we used to call it, on sports clubs. Many of them. I'm one thing about myself, I love the outdoors and I love sport. I have participated in that all my life. And some of the and then with larger organisations, because some community governance organisations are actually managing quite a lot of asset and resources. As Amanda said, in the end, it's about managing risk. The board has a governance role, and part of that role is to effectively to oversee the management. So in the end, a policy is about managing risk. As I alluded to, if we start right at the beginning, a very, in my view, important policy is an induction policy. Is just how do you bring a new member onto your committee or board, and how do you bring them up to speed as quickly as you can in terms of what you expect of them and what really they're there to do. I think everyone on this call might agree that is actually quite important, because otherwise, as I said before, people can get disillusioned, but also, when you're in the meeting, you don't feel like you're achieving anything. And that's the last thing that people want in today's busy society, is sitting around talking a lot, as we used to do in the sports clubs, and really not achieving much.
Yes, and that's just about effective making priorities throughout the year, what you're going to spend your time in, so you do feel like you're adding value. Induction number one, I think we're going to get into this a little bit about getting to what are our most top key policies that we need in our policy kind of toolbox. Induction, we hear this so much about induction policies. I think we are definitely getting better in this space about making sure we've got them, but also we've had feedback about having a board member might mentor the new person coming in, so induction. So maybe that's part of writing that into your policy, making sure that you're not just saying it, but you're embedding it into good practice and how you're going to look after that board member. We've got a little bit about that in our good governance code as well, about things that you kind of need. But Amanda, what do you think about the difficulties sometimes we get in the shaping of what is a governance policy, what's a management? And
there's so much risk. I've been involved with organisations where I've actually seen them write the policy and almost start the implementation or the how-to. So it's straddled both. It's been like a management tool or a guideline versus a governance policy. I don't want to be obtuse or grey in this answer, but every organisation is different. And, there's some community sports group like what Mark was saying, where you might find that the treasurer is also the one managing the local netball team or being the coach, and so in it, as well as trying to have a governance hat on. For me, when I reflect on that, I think there's a couple of things I've just written down. Just having that assessment as a board of what's relevant, where the line in the sand is, and I think that can often change depending on who sits around the board table. So I'd urge to perhaps not have a black and white around this is a management policy or this is a governance policy, simply because it's often too hard in community groups. So the better way, or the way that might be suitable for people to deal with it, is maybe having a review cycle, where there's actually a policy agenda item where annually the board sits down and goes, well, hey, are we resourced more accordingly now? Or have we got different people around the table where they've elevated, the governance, or they've now provided distance between management and governance because we've got additional funding to pay for resource. So yeah, it's really important for the groups themselves to identify when and where policies sit, and then equally ensure that there's a review process that accommodates any changes that might be made depending on what the organisation's facing. Does that make sense, Rose?
Yeah, and I think kind of touched on a question I've got, which is around the monitoring and how do we evaluate the effectiveness of our policies and procedures. Sometimes our organisations are reviewing them a lot, but sometimes board members are busy, might not be getting to them. There's a bit of frustration. It's just, when do we get into a regular pattern of policy reviews? Do we carve out time that everyone does it together? Do some people take responsibilities, that kind of thing? What do you think you've seen that's worked well?
Again,
well, I think, sorry, Amanda. Yep.
No, it's fine, Mark. I was just going to say, again, I think it depends on the organisation. If it's a set of policies and it's a very operational board or committee, like I was saying, maybe having that yearly, but it's not so much going through line by line in the policies. It's has anything changed in our circumstances, which means we can relinquish this as a policy or move it to a, procedures or some other form of documentation. What I've seen work really, really, really well is just, if you've got, let's say, 6 policies, spread them throughout the year. Let's have one policy assessed each meeting, and it might be a 5-minute job, because remember, once it's done, you're solely assessing what are the circumstances that may have changed, and therefore, checking it off. So that might not be a long discussion, that might be 5 minutes. So spreading them out. Sometimes I've actually noticed that 3 years is kind of the review cycle that tends to be at the top of a lot of policies. And that, if that's forgotten and the policy's chucked in the bottom drawer, might not be enough. So it is a really fine balance. But I think key is, if you can spread the policies out across your board meetings rather than doing them all at one lump time, that makes a lot of sense. But annually, you might want to have an agenda item which is specifically about, has our resourcing levels changed in the structure of our organisation, where we can now define what sits with governance and what sits with management.
Yeah, that's that's really helpful, Amanda. Did you have any? Sorry, Mark. Did you want to make some comments there, or because I like what Blair said too, just to go back onto the induction one. Sorry, Blair's saying about.
Sorry.
Sorry, sorry, it's the old Zoom delay. So I was just mentioning what Blair has said in the comments about induction and reasonable timing and expectations when one commits to a role. So again, I think that's in the policies is the chance to set what you would like to be seeing happen. So it's your actual opportunity to say, we want someone to come on, but they need to have this time and commitment, and this is our expectation of what we see as important to our organisation. So, sorry, Mark, I just wanted to bring up that was a good comment.
It is a very good. I see. I'm watching the comments. I don't know if everybody can see them, but they're very good comments. The just one thing I'd like to say too, in terms of policies overall, is that depending on your organisation, and a lot of the ones on this call are, are smaller, and I don't expect, in terms of talking to boards and also being on boards, that I don't expect a 10-page policy for everything. In fact, I recommend that if you're not Fonterra, that you don't have a 10-page policy, that you have a 1-page one, which everybody understands. And as Amanda said, that you look at it every 12 months or so, because in the end, the members have to be clear what the policy is. And for example, if a new member joins the board or the organisation, and one of the first things that comes up in the agenda is any conflicts, anyone to declare a conflict, and the new member doesn't know what that means, or if they know what it means, they're not quite sure how it applies to this organisation, then that's a failure, because it's actually a very important policy. But it's the existing board's job to ensure that the new member is clear what you mean. So a conflicts policy could be, I don't know, 6 bullet points. But the important thing is that everybody understands it.
I think that's exactly what we need. Is sometimes they are very long and quite detailed and time consuming, and there's people on the call that will love policies, and they're probably here because they love it, and there's another kind of part of our group that are not that keen on policies, and that's why we're here too, like to better understand it. So policies, like you said, Mark, conflict of interest register, it's a really important one, because it's not just here's a register and you put all your conflicts on it and that's done and dusted. It's digging down a little bit more into it. So you might have you might know someone that's very close to a contract that your organisation's pointing. It's understanding what that means, just like you've shared, Mark. So Francis has said common language. Totally true. It's practical. Like, just make it easy. If everyone's kind of like, oh, I'm not really responding, then maybe something's not really right, because they're not understanding what it is. Also, like what Rachel said, so each policy should identify an owner with review, revision, responsibility. I think that's a good way to monitor it. But then equally, if you don't have many, or you have a really great toolbox, we'll get that into that soon. It should be everyone also takes responsibility. So so far we've definitely got induction and conflict of interest. Those two have come through. But one of the questions that I've got is, what are some of the key policies we need in our policy toolbox? When I say policy toolbox, it's pretty much if we had quite a lot over the years. Some of our organisations been around for a long time, so we've collated a huge amount of policies. We're going through the motions. Do we ever kind of stop and say, these are the top ones we need? What are they? And equally to what you're saying, Amanda, is we've had crisis, like we've seen the last couple of years, a pandemic, climate change. How do we respond? Have we got new policies? Have we got the cyber tech, the privacy, the data, the climate change response? Yeah, have we got to a good place in our community organisations that we are policy future-proofing ourselves a little bit rather than, you know what I mean, like going through the motions? Do you think we're there?
I think that's really interesting. I was running through some old policies from different organisations, and I found a COVID-19 policy that was obviously written in the midst of what would have been lockdown or just prior, I think. And I suppose there's another question to that, Rose. At the time, that was absolutely critical. Understanding who to allow into spaces, understanding how to protect your staff. And the tone of it is very much around COVID-19. And so I suppose the challenge is at a point in time like that, you develop the policy that's most needed, but then how do you integrate that? Because who knows, I hate to say it, there might be a COVID 2029 and you know, another year. So I wonder, there's a challenge with that. Relevancy at a given time might prioritise one policy over another, but what's critical is embedding some of the key foundational stuff so that it can be ongoing or that learnings are understood around how we protect staff. I think obviously the critical one that we all know about is health and safety, and that now has a well-being lens to it as well. So as a board, you can't get away with not having that and acknowledging the well-being requirements, particularly when it comes to your duty of understanding organisational culture and looking after your people. Some of the others that have been interesting, working from home, it seems to be a new policy that has kind of nudged its way up in terms of priority, and again, probably consequence of COVID. And one that I found really interesting, which I myself haven't had to implement in the organisation I work for, but I know for many community organisations, is home visit policies. If your work in the community is going into someone else's space, how do you protect yourself, also protecting them, taking care of that relationship and making sure that the requirements around that aspect of your job are looked after in terms of your policy? So there's some kind of random ones, but they can be really, really critical depending on time and intent of your organisation. Obviously, things like credit card policies and sensitive expenditure, again, the duty of being a steward of public money means that they're equally important depending on what you do. Computer use and privacy, that's the one when you start reading, information around, you know, privacy requirements, how to keep information confidential and so forth. That is something that I think boards need to be really across now as well.
Yeah, and you kind of touch on something, Amanda, but that is that when does this become, and this is the big issue, because it's the governing and checking in and setting the culture, but then again, not dictating a little bit what's happening in the management, because we had a comment come through from Robin about the operational aspect of that policy is more management. So, but yeah, it's being more clear about if we've got a health and safety policy and the board's just checking in and making sure that management's, there's no risks or there's no issues that have happened, and but not getting into the management functionality. Mark, do you have some comments about how to kind of keep it, because I think some separation here is needed so that we're not dipping into management, or examples you've seen good policies?
Yeah, I'll give an example which might help. That when I was chairing the Hillary Outdoors Board, which used to be Outdoor Pursuit Centre, because of the nature of the organisation, the board's most important and leading agenda item was health and safety. because we had thousands of young people coming through our courses, and we had the terrible tragedy at Mangatapopo where 7 young people died. So, we had a very clear health and safety policy, and it said things like, we, as a board, our expectation is that there will be no more than, X number of harm incidents in a given year, and those incidents obviously would be low level, and we were interested, of course, in the trend. So that hopefully was clearly communicated to the chief executive and management. So they were very clear what was expected and what the outer limits of any health and safety incidents were. So, that's perhaps an illustration of just how these policies work in practice, that it was just so important for that organisation to focus on, that the policy at the board level needed to be clear and set by the board, and then clearly communicated to the management, who then had tangible parameters in which they could operate.
Yeah, so clearly identifying your risk, because it's come up. I think Rami has made a comment about what about risk. So, and obviously in your organisation, high risk area, and then for some of us who don't have volunteers or somewhat management, big teams, it's a different, isn't it? Health and safety is obviously a lot lesser, but for this one, it's totally. We've got a comment from Lee about code of conduct policy for board members. I think this is up and I put this up in the top 5 for sure. What do you both think?
Definitely. I find it interesting though, sometimes it's not referred to as a policy, but your code of conduct, absolutely critical. It's setting the expectations of board members, but also allowing management to understand what the expectation is of their leaders, and in turn they should be reflecting that. I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That I like to think of it as an integrity policy. Absolutely critical, and a well agreed policy between the members, and then and assuming the members actually comply with it, which we all hope they will. It'll transform your organisation.
Yeah, I like that one. It's integrity, it's mana, it's values, it's holding yourself to account, and because you are accountable to stakeholders, your community, your funders, your board members, yourself, like it's huge responsibility. So we're getting in with that toolbox, and it is around, so for me, I'm keeping track of what some of these priorities have been that we kind of mentioned, but we've got induction, conflict of interest, talked about health and safety and wellbeing, code of conduct for boards, and I see we have a comment around tangata whenua, engagements, iwi sit in the community governance space in Aotearoa. What are the policies that we see as critical? Where does tangata whenua representation on boards, etc. sit? Is that Karai Tiana? That's a great question. Something that community governance Aotearoa, we have been working on a policy pack for our community, and it's based off the top kind of priorities, because we want to put them together and give some templates out for everyone that they can use. And we have been looking at a Te Tiriti policy, and it's more set around the principles of partnership, participation, protection. It's more set at a kind of higher level, because we do have lots of organisations, community organisations that have significant legal responsibilities in the social services sector, that kind of thing, or the health. So they do have some very strong, already embedded kind of responsibilities. But we are working on a policy around that, around how do we be inclusive, participate, decision making, that kind of thing. So if anyone's got any other policies they might know of please share with them in the chat function, because we've got lots of
I think board
lots of links.
recruitment, Rose, is really critical as well. And so often there might be a policy around how to recruit a CE, because that's always seen as a bit of a risk, right, to an organisation. Equally, I think making sure that the representation is often reflective of the community, or that there's diversity. So having an actual board recruitment policy or some principles around there is really high up there as well. And Rose, the other one that we did talk about a little bit was around like cybersecurity and privacy, which obviously needs to be in that, up in that list as well.
Yes, you can see how the policies start getting bigger and bigger, don't they? And we're trying to get them back to smaller and more contained. So, yes, okay, so lots of policies in place that we need to think about. Also ones that haven't always been on our radar, which is in that cyber tech space. Data privacy is a very big one. Climate change. Come across any climate change policies?
I haven't directly, but I know that as a region, there's a lot of discussion around that, particularly in terms of investment and philanthropic bodies. So it would be unfair of me to imply that I knew the best practice and what to do, but I can certainly say for us, it's something that we're considering, you know, quite significantly in terms of what our role is and yeah, how is that implemented into kind of the policies and procedures that we undertake.
And some good comments coming in. Yes, treaty principles, online. And we've got some great articles. As community research has got some te tiriti analysis coming in there. So thank you for sharing, everyone. So we've got lots of different policies, lots of different things that we need to think about, and it sets the culture of the organisation, doesn't it? Like what you put in writing is your intention, and that is really important. That's the crux of it. What do you want to see and what do you want to make happen? What about when we have policy breaches or disputes? What happens when things go wrong, and how do we, you know, we've got a conflict of interest, code of conduct. What happens when someone breaches it? Our board members, chair, how do we respond to that? How do we enact upon our own policies?
I suppose that's sorry, Mark, you go.
Well, in my experience, on any community board upwards, communication is the key. So where there is an alleged or perceived breach of a policy by a member, then, you know, it's a bit like a fact-finding job, but in the end, you know, you do as best you can to find out exactly, you know, find out the true facts, not just innuendo and allegation. And what happens after that is, well, it depends on your board composition, but really what happens after that should have a significant involvement of the chair. If you don't have a chair, then whoever it is that's meant to be leading or directing your organisation needs to be involved. Because every situation is different, it's hard to say more than that. And if it's the chair or the sort of the lead of the organisation that's the problem, then that gets a bit tricky. But in the end, you know, although a person is a chair of a board, as you know, everybody, I hope that a board is a board. You know, all members are equal. And so it really will fall on the members, the other members, to deal with the issue as they see fit.
It sounds, yes, it's actually really difficult, isn't it? Amanda, have you got some examples you could share? I bet we've all got some more stories, but
yeah, I'm so lucky. I don't have any, you know, direct example I've been involved in, which is great. It's an absolute blessing to have had good boards. But I do think this is where the code of conduct is really, really, really useful, because while they might be breaching a policy within that code of conduct, at least they're exploring it and putting it together. You can have those really robust debates as a board around, so this is our code of conduct. What happens when things go wrong or people don't abide by it? So I think the transparency around we're developing this for a reason. Equally, it needs to be, and what happens when people, don't fulfill their obligations. So for me, yes, I think the code of conduct is where everything hangs on, and how to resolve any conflicts related to policy breaches can come in under that.
Yes, that's probably a good comment from you, Mark, is there's probably steps that we can take before we get down to that. One couple of things, like you said, is communication's key. So before you get to that stage, making sure that you've got open conversations happening, addressing things that need to be said, and handling it in a process before we go down the road, potentially needing a lawyer like yourself, Mark. But it is important to get to investigate. Something that you said, Mark, is investigate as well. Make sure that we've done our due diligence ourselves as a board, and if we do need to maybe have a moderator or mediator involved before we have to go down and embed some of the other things that get into needing a lawyer or some worst case kind of scenario. We've got quite a few questions coming in. Some is about reviewing our policies in regular kind of periods as well. So we got in here, we do have a comment about asking if we could go back into a little bit more of the governance and operations. And I do think this is really important because, yes, I know that we've got different types of organisations, different accountabilities, but when you are the sports committee or just a local kind of group, what are the priorities for the governing ones that aren't getting into operational? So could you share a little bit more to kind of demystify what's a governance responsibility of a policy rather than the operations? And this is coming from Stephen. So he's saying basically wondering whether or how the board interacts with operational policies when we're dipping our toes into the management, as we often hear. I think it's probably good to go back a little bit and explore this a bit more if we can. Amanda?
Yeah, for sure. So I just always say compliance is key. Anything that's high risk, and again, that's variable depending on your organisation, has to sit with governance. I was reading something actually, and I made a note of it. And they actually said you break policies down into 3 areas. Obviously, there's the delegation of authority and code of conduct would be one, but then you've also got communications policies, and then you've got people policies. Now that confused me a little bit because I was thinking, well, hold on, people policies, aside from recruitment of the CE and so forth, when it comes to performance management, should that be a governance responsibility? And I must admit, it's something I've really struggled with, and across the organisations I've been involved in, every single one's been different, and it's been down, again, like I said earlier, to how much resource they've actually got, because sometimes board members will be stepping into operational because it's the only space they have. So I think it's, I think it really comes down to probably having that discussion directly between the CE, management or staff, and the board itself around what can be managed and on which side of the ledger. I don't know if it's as cut and dry as this is management and this is governance. I don't know, Mark, you might have a different view.
Yeah, I think the person that's asking the question, the reality is that there is a blurred line there, or can be, because I receive letters quite regularly saying to me, that's a governance matter, that's an operational matter, and you're blurring the two. Well, the reality is that as a board, as members, you yes, you're not there to manage the organisation. If you have a management team, of course, I'm very conscious that many of these organisations are very small. However, I'll give you an example. A very important policy, which we haven't really talked about, is your financial policies. There's lots of them. That's why the big companies have audit and risk committees. But one very important one for any organisation is to have delegated authority for spending. And that might be the treasurer. And in my organisation, where I happen to be chair, the chief executive, because there was one, had made certain representations to the board over a meeting or three, and I started to have some nerves about that. And as chair, I spoke to him and said, "I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm starting to disbelieve you." Well, it turned out, long story short, that in fact he had been lying. So, as Amanda said, I won't go into the detail, but the board, and particularly myself, had to actually get involved in operations for a while because the chief executive was lying. And that leads to lots of things. But you do, let me say one thing, never take at face value everything a chief executive or treasurer says. You're not expected to go through the accounts line by line, but there's ways and means that you can double check that what you're being told at a governance level is actually correct. It's one of the board's functions, and how to do it is really hard. You get better at it as time goes on, but to be aware of the issue is the most important thing.
Yeah, that is fantastic comment, Mark, because I think the financial policies, and it's good that we touched on it, because it's number one, isn't it? Our responsibilities as board members is in the financial success of the organisation, but it's our job to not just check the financial accounts that they come in with. We're meeting monthly and we have a look through and we ask some questions, but it is important if we're asking the questions and we're not getting the answers, it's not that we don't understand it. You need to, if you're getting an answer that you think, oh, that's not right, it is your job to dig in and keep asking. It's not your job to sit back and say, well, they said that, they must be right. Like, it's your responsibility. And there are red flags that come, isn't there, where if you're kind of getting fobbed off a bit and you don't get the answer you want, it's kind of telling you something. So I think, yes, a financial policy is there to guide you on, like you said, Mark, delegation, spending, making sure that we've got that checks and balances in place. About how we're spending it, or who's got the amount that someone can spend to, but it's also asking the financial questions about the sustainability of the organisation. So I think there was a question actually earlier on about being asked about, do we have enough money in the bank? Well, then there's two schools of thoughts here, because sometimes you've got too much money banked up and you're supposed to be using it. So yeah, but it's not just the policy, isn't it? It's about your thinking of, are you asking those risk questions? Are you asking, is this the right amount of money that we are paying for communication contract, or a certain type of contract? It's asking those questions to make sure that everything's kind of fair and transparent. But yeah, really good points about financial policies. Did you have something to add, Amanda? And then we've got got a couple more questions.
No, not at all. I did love that. The point that was made earlier about the amount in reserves, whether it's 6 months of operational or a year or whatever. I think that's a really meaningful discussion. I was just thinking, I'm not sure whether we've had that sit in a financial policy or whether that has been, kind of a separate reviewed statement at point where we're discussing financial. So it might not be a policy as such. The other thing, of course, is I'm trying to think of the SIPO. Some of you will know what that is, some of you won't, but in terms of the investment, how you split your investments, that's really critical. So, how much you're putting in bonds or a term deposit or whatever, and that's if you're lucky enough to have some money. But again, that needs to be really well debated across the board, and that should be a governance responsibility.
Another policy, Rose, that I'd like to just sort of put front and centre is the what I like to call a sustainability policy, which in the past we've thought of that as recycling rubbish, but that's an environmental sustainability policy. I'm talking about, and it's really part of your strategic plan, really, but it's a policy that says how do we know we're going to be here in 10 years, or 15? And the beauty of that, you can do these things different ways, but the beauty of it is that it brings in many different things, including the board's, going back to a question I saw, the board's involvement with Satiriti and iwi, and how that's going to be going forward because of our society has changed, and we all value iwi values, and we want to bring those more on board and other things. So the sustainability, you can call it lots of different things, but it's an important one, I think, these days.
Yes, it's financial sustainability, isn't it, of the organisation? It's and that's a nice way of putting it. Like, how do we know that we'll be here in 10 years? We can't answer that. It's going to tell us something, isn't it? So I like what John said. There's no such thing as dumb question, only dumb answer. Well, the thing is, you've got to ask it. That's the thing. You've got to be brave enough to say, I don't think you're spending this, or can you? You've got to step up and ask the question. But he's also mentioned about metrics, which is one of the questions I do have, which is how do we monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of our policies? And the procedures. So there's a little bit of comment in there about policies and procedures as well. But how do we know that we've got all these policies in place and that they're working, or how do we measure this?
I don't know.
Do we just say we've got it? We've got a policy? Is that? I don't think that's probably going to be effective.
I think it's about is the policy being enacted correctly? Is it being adhered to by staff? Is probably maybe the way I'd look at it. I don't think, when it comes down to metrics and success, it's about that strategy, it's about that impact, it's about, driving forward. And that's from the work we're doing, less than the policy is just merely, a framework to some degree of what's in the, are we sticking to the lane, or have we veered off a bit too far? So, I'd be interested to hear Mark's view on that, because I don't know about measuring success of policies.
I think the only real way to measure success, well, that's not quite true. You can have metrics, and of course, the bigger your organisation, the more you'll have. But in the end, if the organisation is operating well, and the board, when you're on a community board, you just know, I think any board after a while, whether it's operating well, seems the organisation. There's a limited number of issues coming before the board. That won't continue forever, I guarantee it. But it's just like you get a sense that things are operating as they should be. And as we said before, the annual review at a minimum of the policies is important, because let's be honest, let's think of one, what's a good policy? Let's just say it's your sustainability policy. It comes up for review, and let's be honest. A lot of the time, as members, we look at it and think, "Oh, yeah, I forgot we had that policy, and I don't remember at all what was in it." And that's okay, because there could be a few policies that you're meant to be trying to remember, but in a way, that's monitoring how you're going, because by reminding yourselves that we do have this policy, then you can ask the question, well, how are we going with that? And so on. So hard to monitor, yes. Financial ones, no, that they should have metrics around them, but some of them are hard to monitor. But the review process will act as a backstop for the review work that the board probably isn't doing or hasn't done.
Yeah, I think if we might have to have a look at Robin's comment. So she's in a new organisation, 20 governance policies, 140 operational policies. I would imagine maybe, Robin, you've got a huge organisation. That sounds like quite a lot. And I think that's it, review them. Are they actually fit for purpose? Because if they're not, get rid of them. We've got lots of new things that have come about, like, working from home. Lots of future stuff that we're kind of talking about. So it does sound quite substantial. And then another one was about auditing as well. So it was a good comment.
I wonder as well, though, I mean, for some of you, you might have in your agenda items perhaps a strategy session where your board kind of debates what's happening, the future of the organisation, where it's going. I wonder if there's a part of that, but one of those discussion topics, one of the strategic discussion topics might be looking at your policies and saying, are they hindering or are they a barrier to fulfilling the direction that we want to go? Because just in thinking about certain historical situations I've been in, maybe the policies have restricted an approach to something which has either stifled the strategy or meant that it's taken longer. And so the board may need to review that. So I'll be saying policy success is making sure you've got your lanes, you know where you're going, everything's good. Policy failure would be where it's intervening, presenting barriers, stopping the team from heading in the right direction. So I just wanted, that could be a really amazing, kind of strategy discussion at some point in a year with your board. Yeah.
I think that's what we need in our policies. If you went back and you just put a statement piece, like Mark said, where do we want it to be? And are we going to be here in 10 years' time for a financial one? That's just a way to couch all the things that you think that you might need. It's the same for your code of conduct or your induction. How are we looking after new board members that are coming on? Are we taking care of them? Are we making sure that they have all the information they need? Are we supporting them with what they need? If we just have that as a question, that kind of couches what the policy is about. Rather, I think we get too policy driven and too many tick boxes in the policy, and we lose sense of what's that policy about? I think the other one is with policies is you can kind of tell if you're not doing very well because you'll be losing board members or staff. That's a real easy metric. If you're losing good people, your culture's not right, that's a red flag. Get back to your purpose, I think. Okay, we have, actually that's gone rather quick because this is a very detailed kind of conversation. We've had so many comments coming through in the chat, so it's been amazing. And I just want to say, if we haven't got to a question, we will come back to the team, and I've got heaps of resources as well from all different organisations who have got some great policies out there and guides. Community governance, Aotearoa, we're also working on a little policy pack, and this will help us with this as well. But before we wrap, because we've got about 5 minutes, we like to take it right to the wire. Do you have anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I had a few just kind of things that I thought might be useful takeaways. So do take them or leave them, only my 2 cents. Just kind of revisiting the fact that, it is grey. Every organisation is different. What sits on one side, in terms of policies for governance versus procedures for management is something that needs to be debated, and it should be debated at the table. It should be a really robust discussion about where we sit and what goes where, and that'll come down to resource for every organisation. So that was one thing. The other thing is there will be relevance in certain policies to certain organisations and not others. And so getting a list, and it might be a list of 20, whoever's dealing with 20 governance policies, stripping them back out, is it actually relevant to what we do? Other thing for me, which I've always done, and a lot of people don't do it, so again, take it or leave it, is I think our policies often have to go back to our principles and values. So have a think about whether when you're developing your policies or reviewing them, whether it aligns with your values. Are our values being represented in these policies and what we're doing? So I've tended to historically add sections about that. It's just that chance to kind of double check that it's reflective of the organisation's intent. And board change, really seeing policies as a tool for consistency is super useful when it comes to managers and CEs and things. So making sure that the policies are used and presented to those new board members so that everyone's always on the same page. So that was probably my 3 or 4 points, Rose, that I thought might be useful to sum up.
I think, Mark.
Yeah. From me, there's a wonderful scene in an old movie which illustrates this governance point really well. I'm old enough to remember the movie Chariots of Fire. Some of you might too, some of you won't. Anyway, there's a meeting of the British Olympic Committee, and the Prince of Wales is there, and Lord this and Lord that. And a matter comes before them, which is about the Scottish runner, whether he's allowed to run on a Sunday or not at the Olympics. And one of the lords says, we can't decide this. He says, this is a matter for the committee. And the Prince of Wales says, we are the committee. And the point is that's why we have policies, because the board needs to know what its roles and responsibilities are. And by having your policies and within the policy procedures, you're defining for yourself what you're about. And I'm talking about policies in particular, not your strategic plan. That's another issue. And so then it helps you to know that when matters come up, you can decide whether you are the committee or whether it's a matter that needs to go to the management, if you have some, or it's really just a management and operational issue. So that, to me, illustrates nicely why policies are just so important for governance purposes.
They really are, and they, this is why this conversation is so important. Sometimes they're just really tricky, and sometimes we have so many that we've kind of been given, and you come into it and you're kind of like, oh, I don't really know if this is us. So, but if you see them as a way to influence what you want to be seen as and values-based, I think that's a good starting point for us. And then maybe get rid of all the other ones that you really don't need and they're not fulfilling the purpose, because everyone can do with, you don't want to waste your time on it. So thank you to Amanda and Mark. You guys have been absolutely fabulous. Thank you to everyone who's come onto this call today. Thank you to Havana Coffee Works. All of our board talks are freely available, and we'll be sending this out post this talk. But I just want to say, fantastic conversation today. Lots of resources, lots of information and links. I don't think this will be the first and last that we have to talk about policies, because I think they are still quite complicated, and we do kind of need as much help as we can get. But have a fabulous weekend, and thank you to everyone who's been with us today. So, ka kite anō till next time. Thank you.